My name's Kerry. I'm also one of the intern psychologists here at the Cancer Society. And thank you for joining via Zoom. We had to be a bit flexible with what we were doing with the increase in levels. And I hope you're all staying safe in your bubbles. So yeah, like Amy said, you're all on mute, but I will be unmuting everyone at the end, so you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions and have a chat to each other if you wish to as well. So yeah, so welcome, and we today are going to do a talk on navigating loss and change, which is a really important topic in this context. And I'm sure just in that title you can think of one or two things that really resonate with you in the journey that you or your whānau and friends are going through. And with bringing up exploring loss and change for you personally, and also in this general sense that I'm going to be talking to you all about today, it can bring up some strong emotions. And if you feel that that happens for you today, know that it is actually really normal and understandable. And if you wish to turn off your video, you're more than welcome to at any point throughout today. And just be kind to yourself and see how you go. I will be also providing a handout straight after our talk today, so don't feel you have to take down everything that we talk about. I will send that through because we will be covering quite a lot in the next hour or so. Okay. Right. So just to give you a bit of context about what today is going to look like, I'm first going to talk about loss and change within this context in a really general sense, and also with kind of the patterns and stages of loss and change that we often see throughout this journey. I'm then going to be talking about what does the process of loss and change look like, and in that comes grief, which we'll go into in the next couple of slides, and just the acknowledgement that there is actually a process that we all go through when there isn't a big adjustment in our life. And I will also be talking about anticipatory grief, and that might be a new term or something that you haven't heard of before, but again is really common in this context. And that's about adjusting to potential losses to come, or foreseeable or anticipated losses to come, or anticipated changes to come as well. And then we're going to go through, we'll have a bit of a break, bit of a tea or stretch break. And then in the second half, we're going to go through, okay, well, how do we actually walk alongside this loss and change and this process of grief, and some real practical strategies to walk alongside this. And then some extra support as well and resources, which I'll be sending through at the end, like I said. Okay. So again, it's probably quite quite obvious when we just say loss and change, and you can probably think of things in your own context. But what we know is there's an incredible amount of change and adjustment throughout the cancer journey, both as a patient, but also as whānau or friends or supporters of anyone impacted by cancer. And often we talk about this kind of roller coaster of emotions, or waves of emotion or distress. In a general sense, we often see quite a peak in the diagnosis, and a lot of people talk about it feeling like quite a big shock, or kind of out of the blue, almost a sense of disbelief. But a whole range of emotions can really peak during that time. And it really does make sense, because there's a lot of unknowns, a lot of uncertainty, right? But also there's a lot of changes and a lot of anticipated changes or potentially losses that might come to the forefront as well. So there's a lot of adapting in that time. And then we often see it might tailor down a little bit, but then again peak just before treatment or at the start of treatment. And again, it's another point of a lot of adjustment, a lot of unknowns, but also potentially a lot of anticipated losses as well. And often that does settle. And then again, we see a bit of a peak in distress, emotional distress around post-treatment and potentially the future as well. And this is a bit of an unexpected peak for a lot of people, but actually it makes a lot of sense. So when you look at, again, it's another stage of change. It's another stage of uncertainty. What now? Maybe questions about what does the future look like for me? Or maybe again, some anticipated losses and changes. But it's also about processing what you've also been through. And often people describe this first part through diagnosis and treatment as being quite quick. Going through from diagnosis to treatment is just kind of getting through it day to day. And then at the end, there seems to be a little bit of a space to then actually look at what's happened and actually process those changes. So although it seems unexpected, it makes a lot of sense that that can happen. And you might actually even tie that in with a delayed grief response or a delayed emotional distress there. But we'll get into kind of that grief topic in the next slide and talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. But yeah, we often do see this kind of general pattern of emotions going up and down. And that is actually a really normal response to, the context in which a lot of people find themselves in. And it's actually part of the process of coming to terms with the changes you might be experiencing. And just to acknowledge that there is a process, and everyone's way of processing this will be unique. And as I said before, it's also the friends and supporters as well that might be going through a lot of changes, a lot of losses as well. So it is often, everyone's affected by this. And if you are feeling this kind of ups and downs and emotions, that is actually really normal and a really natural response that we often see. And I think, another point just to go through before we kind of carry on with the slides is to actually acknowledge that we can't have love, meaning, value, and life really without pain, grief, suffering, and loss, and that they often come hand in hand. And that can actually provide a little bit of comfort or a little bit of a grounding sense as well, that actually if you're feeling distressed or you're feeling some emotional responses through loss and change, that actually it means that what you lost really mattered to you. And I think this quote really captures that nicely at the bottom of the screen here. To not acknowledge grief would be not acknowledging something you lost mattered to you. So I think that's really powerful and something that can be quite grounding as well. And so this is where the terminology of grief comes through. And so what is grief? Grief is often spoken about in terms of the loss of a loved one. And absolutely that is important. But also grief is the response to the actual, but also threatened loss of something or someone that is important to you. And often grief isn't spoken about in that sense. So anyone that's lost or has a threatened loss of importance or meaning comes along with it as this natural grieving process. And actually, if you're feeling those emotional kind of roller coasters or ups and downs through loss and change, it's actually, you're probably going through some form of a natural grieving process, and that's actually really normal. So in the context of what we see, we often see a lot of loss and a lot of changes around, the physical body. So a lot of people report difficulties or report grieving the anticipated or actual loss of limbs or hair or dependence, just a change in physical capabilities. There might come along pain, fertility difficulties, and a big grieving process there, and a whole myriad of other physical losses and changes that I'm sure you'll be able to resonate with. And we also see a lot of social changes. A lot of people describe changes in intimacy in their immediate relationships. There's also a lot of difficulty with people they might have thought were really close to them have withdrawn or weren't necessarily there for them. But also on the other side of the coin, a lot of people that have come through with a lot of support, and so that is something that some people talk about as well. And of course, there's the loss of a loved one, and also the anticipated loss of a loved one, or a poor prognosis for your own self as well. And that is part of this journey for a lot of people. And of course, as that natural grieving process will be occurring as well. And that's really quite difficult to sit with. And that kind of links in with spiritual changes as well. I have a lot of people say, well, I've actually found a newfound connection to my spirituality, religion, or culture. Or people say, actually, I felt a little bit distance from that when trying to come to terms with end of life or mortality. And, end of life and mortality and those types of things can come up for a lot of people, even when they first get diagnosed, even when people don't know their prognosis. Actually, getting diagnosed can maybe bring forward those kind of fears or feelings or thoughts around end of life or one's future. And that is something we're not used to sitting with either, and naturally can be really difficult. And then there's a lot of changes which are kind of intangible, more kind of psychological, as we put it, but really, really important. A lot of people talk about a change of identity, which makes a lot of sense if often we build our identity upon activities we do, or maybe how we appear, our looks, what we do as work. A lot of those types of things can change and thus lead to a real change or loss in identity, which can be difficult to work through. The other thing is a sense of control that comes up all the time, because as human beings, we love to be in control. And we kind of come into this world with this expectation that we actually have control over everything. There's expectation that if we do X, Y, Z, we'll be okay. But with hardship and going through difficult experiences, we soon learn that actually, these types of things don't discriminate, and that we don't often have a lot of control over what life throws at us. And it's about finding, okay, what can I control right now? And that's what we'll go through in the later slides as well. Trust is another theme that comes through, loss of trust in oneself or body or other people. And again, that's reflective of a lot of kind of hardship and that experience as well. And, all of these things really make sense. And what's really behind this is the meaning we place on these things. And when there's a change or a loss, that is reflective of that meaning that we have there. And it's a really natural thing to have to try and, adjust to. So hopefully this slide kind of gave you an idea that maybe you're not alone in what you're experiencing. And actually, it kind of makes sense that if you are feeling kind of emotional distress, that it makes sense, because things that you love, or things that you find value in, or that are close to who you are as a person, have adjusted. You know, that's really hard to kind of come back from and work through. And it's a process. And part of the process is actually feeling those emotions. And that it's actually very normal. So on that kind of train of thought, everyone grieves differently. Just as we love and find meaning to different things, everyone also grieves differently. And there's no right or wrong way to grieve and process those losses and changes. Some common emotional responses are, you know, feelings of anger or irritability. There might be sadness, low mood, natural anxieties and worries about the future or present or even past as well. Or for other people, your whānau, your friends, that's a really natural thing to come up, and it's okay to think about those things. Another thing people talk about is feeling quite numb or shocked, or in a realm of disbelief. Often that's in that initial diagnosis. And as I'm going through this list, you might think, oh yeah, I was that at the beginning, but now I'm just sad. Or you might resonate at those different parts. So it's natural to flick between different emotions as well. And I think this feeling of this numbness, I just want to go through a little bit more in depth, because I have a lot of people saying, oh, I feel numb, I have no emotion, why am I not in a puddle of tears? But actually, the feeling of numbness is an emotional response, and that is actually a response to loss and change. And we'll go through anticipatory grief, and the feelings of relief and numbness and disbelief come through there as well, in terms of when you've anticipated a loss to come. Those feelings might naturally come up once you experience the loss, but we'll go through that in more depth. And there's a real sense of feeling alone or withdrawal for a lot of people, and potentially an increased need for connection as well. Being tearful, it's okay to be tearful. You know, tears release a natural opioid that actually help you heal. And that's another theme. People say, oh, I'm just crying all the time. Is that normal? And again, it is. Absolutely. Everyone grieves differently. And another sense that comes through is this helplessness or meaninglessness. And again, that makes sense if you once were doing certain things that provided a lot of meaning for you, but now you're unable to do them, or there's uncertainty there, then that's understandable that that might be coming through as well. Another emotion that can come through is a feeling of guilt. A lot of people describe feeling a burden for their whānau or friends, or potentially a supporter feeling guilty for not being able to be there all the time. Survivor guilt, something that comes up, you know, why me? Why am I in this situation and not someone else? And again, some really natural thoughts coming through. And you can see how potentially someone might kind of get quite stuck in this space. And again, at the second half of my talk, I'm going to go through, okay, how do we actually acknowledge this and move through these feelings? And it makes sense that if we're in this space and grieving, that it's also going to impact how our physical body is doing. And I'm not too sure how many of you have heard of the fight, flight, or freeze response, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, because it really is in the center of that kind of physiological response to our emotions. So we have a trigger in our midbrain, which lights up when we anticipate threat, or when we are fearful, or any kind of stressor, it might light up. And there's a huge physiological response to that. There's a release of adrenaline and cortisol into our bodies. It pumps all the blood to our major muscle groups. And this would help us fight, flight, or freeze and survive a physical threat, which was really helpful in the caveman times when we were fighting tigers and things like that. But we still have this response today, but actually our stresses aren't something we can fix by fighting or flighting or freezing from. But we still kind of get these responses. And if they're chronically activated, then it can come with a myriad of physical symptoms, such as our heart racing, that butterfly feeling in your tummy, sweaty hands, trembling hands, headaches, a dry mouth. So those types of things can come through. Of course, with those physical symptoms, it might also be medications and treatment side effects and things like that. But we do know that with this fight, flight, or freeze response, we can get those kind of physiological symptoms as well. And again, this might change your appetite. If you don't have any blood in your tummy because it's pumped to those major muscle groups, you're not going to feel that hungry. Our body's designed not to eat a big meal whilst running away from a tiger, right? So your appetite might change. You might take more risk-taking behaviors. Research shows that that might happen as well. And also, naturally, if you're feeling quite anxious or heightened, you're not going to sleep very well either. And that's not to say everyone experiences these, but it's quite common that if you're, really emotionally distressed, you might not be sleeping so well. And again, it makes sense, you wouldn't want to fall asleep whilst trying to run away from a tiger. So yeah, often as well, we're not as distracted when we're trying to fall asleep, and kind of those thoughts and worries can come through then as well. And for some people, they might experience vivid dreams or certain dreams about what they're going through. And that again can be distressing for some people, but also it's a natural process for your mind, which is trying to process those emotions and potentially those experiences that you've gone through as well. The other thing, as I've mentioned, is that kind of spirituality or cultural dimension as well, maybe a growth or a loss in faith. But also, it's not all doom and gloom. With grief or with adversity, some people do experience an increase in meaning finding or perspective or growth, and that is something we'll go through a bit later as well. So again, hopefully this slide provided you with some context and knowledge that, yeah, actually this is pretty normal if I'm feeling these things, and that hopefully you're not alone in that either. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about grief, because it's kind of like this elusive word that we use. And yes, we've defined it. It happens when we lose something or someone, or we have a threatened loss of something or someone we care for or love, or something we care for or love. But we know that grief isn't linear. There's no right or wrong way. But yes, over time we heal, and it does take time. But again, there is no timeline. So it might just be, whatever is right for you. And hopefully you can see the slide. There's a little bit of a picture here, and which is a metaphor that is often used when talking about grief. And you can see there's a box labeled life, if it was that simple, right? But imagine the box is life. And then in the box, we have a big ball labeled grief. And often at the midst of grief, that real sticky part, that ball is really big and touching all sides of the box and hitting that pain button, all those emotions coming through. And there's not much space to move around or do anything. But we know over time the ball will gradually shrink gradually shrink, and then it might bounce around the box quite a bit. And you might be going fine, not really noticing anything, but then one day the ball might hit the pain button, and it might feel like that same day you found the news, or you might feel right back in the midst of it. And that's a really normal thing to occur. We might call this triggers. So it might be a birthday, a baby shower, an anniversary, dates, or events, or even smells or sounds. So this is something that can happen for a lot of people. And it's really important to communicate and ask for support around those days. And again, there's no timeline. If that's a year down from the track, or it's tomorrow, though that grief ball can hit that button, maybe out of the blue as well. But eventually, and over time, it does get smaller, and it might get as small as a grain of rice in that box. And it might just float around and never hit the pain button. It's less likely to. But it is always going to be in your box. And that might be quite confronting initially to think about. But it doesn't mean that the pain button's down all the time. It's just to say that that little ball is in your box. And it's not necessarily something we fix or try to take out of the box. It's something we let be in the box, and actually it's a part of us. It's part of our experiences, and it's something we learn to move through and move alongside. So I hope, that is quite a tricky concept, but I hope that grief box analogy helps kind of make sense of, okay, grief isn't something we try to get rid of. It shrinks over time. We do have triggering days, but that'll get less and less, and it's about how we find more space in the box and move through it. So that brings me to anticipatory grief, which is something that's not often talked about, but again is really important in this context, because at most of the stages there is this anticipated loss or anticipated change to come. Whether it happens or not, it's there, right? And often individuals might be going through this anticipatory grieving process over longer periods of time. And although it's self-explanatory, just to remember, it differs from grief after a loss. It's about grieving before a loss. And it differs in a really key aspect, that actually individuals might find themselves grieving in 3 different time zones. So one might be grieving about the past self, for instance, what one might have been able to do, where someone might have been working previously, those types of things. And then also in the present, potentially changes and losses that are occurring right now, but then also grieving future losses, future worries, potentially this idea that their life is being shortened as well, and that kind of unknown there. So often there is this action to prepare or adjust for those losses. And you can see how, if one is in that kind of grieving space of 3 different time zones, that it makes sense that you'd have this kind of similar emotional and physiological response as if you were actually experiencing the loss right now. And often people describe or go through an actual rehearsal or imagination of the loss, which makes a lot of sense as well. We're trying to prepare, we're trying to adjust for what's going to come. And so if you're noticing, you're imagining what you might look like without hair, or you're imagining what you might look like in the future, or you might even rehearse your own funeral, or what life would look like if you were not around anymore. And although quite confronting, these are natural thoughts to come through, and it's a natural thing to try and rehearse losses to come. But you can see how that can be really distressing at the same time. So it's about acknowledging that this is a real thing, and that these emotions are trying to process, all this adjustment and change. And, there are definitely some things we can do to help you walk alongside this and sit with this easier. And so I think that's a nice space to just have a bit of a break. We've gone through some context and some definitions and some information around loss, change, and grief. And so I think maybe a 5-minute break. You can, stretch or get a cup of tea, and then we can start for going through some strategies. Okay. All right, I think we'll start soon for the second half. I feel like that half an hour went quite fast, didn't it? Okay. Hopefully everyone's back and settled. Okay, so that brings us to, well, how can we, move alongside this adjustment, this loss, this change. And again, it's not about getting rid of that emotional response or trying to fix that. It's actually about, okay, how do we move alongside this and create space in our box? And so mindfulness is one way, one tool that can really help us move alongside these difficult emotions, difficult thoughts and feelings. And I'm not too sure how much each of you know about mindfulness, or whether you have some experience of practicing some mindfulness. But basically what mindfulness is about intentfully bringing attention to your present moment in a non-judgmental way. And by non-judgmental, I mean maybe you've got some difficult feelings coming up, rather than saying, I shouldn't be having these, I'm going to push them away, or I should just be able to get over this. It's about actually going, okay, labeling, I'm feeling really sad right now, and this is really difficult, but actually I'm just going to sit through this. It will pass, and I'm going to focus on the present moment and breathe through this. And actually that's a faster way to allow yourself to move through it. And so you can use this concept with grief quite easily. And I think this reading by Samit Kumar brings that out really nicely. So what is grieving mindfully? It is being consciously aware of the intense pain of loss. It is not indulging in it. It is allowing ourselves to accept it and not run away from it. It is learning to ride the waves of grief. Grieving mindfully means approaching your grief as an opportunity to grow by actively giving meaning to your pain. It is about learning and growing. Now, if you're hearing that and elements of this is quite confronting or not resonating with you, for instance, the word acceptance or finding meaning in the pain, learning and growing even, that's okay. Often that's, this is the first time you might be hearing these types of terminology. And again, acceptance is not about, oh, you should just accept how you're feeling. It's actually more about acknowledging those feelings and walking alongside them, rather than, again, trying to just get rid of them. And we know that doesn't really work. And I guess just be open to some of these concepts. And, like we said, there's no timeline. You might not be quite ready to think about meaning finding yet, but to at least just be open to it and see how you go. Again, you can see how this might help us just draw our attention to the present moment, especially if we're grieving for a future loss, or we've got our thoughts and worries are going towards the future. This technique can really help us bring us to the present moment and provide some space. Also, it's a really great way to just be more in tune with your thoughts, your body, and bring a bit of understanding to that as well. Because when we've got so much going on, appointments or the rush of life and a lot of change happening, we might just be going through the motions. And this is a way that we can really just pause and reflect and just notice what's going on for us. So I thought I would do a really simple, short mindfulness exercise together. And I appreciate that's a little bit hard over Zoom, but, just see how you go. And I invite you to practice with me. And I think we'll do that first before going through, the benefits of it. So I invite you to, get comfortable in your seat if you're sitting down. And just make sure your feet are planted on the floor, flat on the floor. You might want to adjust and shift and get comfortable. And I invite you to either close your eyes or soften your gaze. And I'd just like you to start by taking some deep breaths in through your nose and out through your mouth or nose. In through your nose and out through your mouth or nose. With each out breath, I invite you to relax your body and just release any tension you might be feeling. Maybe in your shoulders, your belly, maybe in your jaw or your face. Just notice and relax and release with each breath. With each in-breath, allowing your belly to inflate like a balloon. And with each out-breath, allowing your belly to deflate. Just finding comfort in the natural rhythm that your breath offers. In and out. In and out. When you're ready, I'd like you to take a moment just to notice your inner world. What's showing up for you right now? Just taking a moment to simply acknowledge and be aware. This may look like I'm noticing some difficult feelings or difficult thoughts coming up. And whatever is coming up for you, I'd like you to simply notice that they're there and gently let them drift out of your awareness, one by one by one. I'd now like you to push your feet firmly to the ground. Just take all your focus directly to your feet. Just noticing what this feels like. You might even wiggle your toes. Can you notice any texture under your feet? Notice any tension in your legs as you wiggle your toes. Just simply noticing and being aware of your feet. You might want to shift your body, stretch and breathe. And actually know that even through difficult feelings and emotions, that you can move through them. And when you're ready, I'd like you to gently open your eyes. And in your mind, I'd like you to label 5 things that you can see in the room or in front of you. And just be present in the room. Great, so that's an example of grounding and mindfulness. So some techniques to actually acknowledge how you're feeling and any physical symptoms coming up for you, but then also using your breathing to ground you, using things in the room to ground you to the present moment. And that can be really useful in moments where you're feeling quite overwhelmed, or those thoughts about the future quite anxiety provoking, or if you're feeling overwhelmed with this kind of grieving process or adjustment. So that can be really good. If you could give me a bit of a thumbs up if you felt calmer or if you felt the effects of that exercise, I'd be really interested to see if you can give me a thumbs up if you feel a bit better after that. Great, so lots of thumbs. Great, yay, me too. And so that shows you it's a really 2-minute exercise, right? That can really be helpful. Another strategy that ties in with this is finding meaning. And this is a really interesting concept, and I think, it ties in with, that meaningless or lack of purpose, which can often naturally come about when things we find meaning in have been taken away from us, or we've had a change there. And this kind of concept was originated with the amazing man Viktor Frankl, who was in the Nazi concentration camps for 3 years of his life. He was a psychotherapist before being in the concentration camps, but he suffered immense loss. He lost his whole family to that, and obviously went through his own suffering through that time as well. And what he found was, I'm going to get him to actually talk through in a YouTube clip on the next slide to do it justice, but he acknowledges that absolutely suffering is experienced, but that often finding meaning or liberating yourself in the choice of how can I respond to the suffering can be really helpful. So again, this reading, I think, resonates with everything we've spoken about so far. Grieving allows us to heal, to remember with love rather than pain. It is a sorting process. One by one, you learn to let go of things that are gone, and you mourn for them. One by one, you take hold of the things that have become part of who you are and build again. So I'm going to get Viktor Frankl to talk a bit about his learnings from that experience. So hopefully you can hear this.
We're going to meet Viktor Frankl, the internationally famous psychiatrist, writer, and lecturer. He deals with the most common ailment of our time, meaninglessness.
Certainly nobody of us is spared suffering at one time or another. But everybody, in the midst of suffering, is given a chance to bear testimony of the human potential at its best, which is to turn a personal tragedy into a human triumph.
Dr. Frankl, what is meant by logotherapy?
Therapy means healing, and logos means meaning. Thus, logotherapy is really healing through meaning, although this, of course, is an oversimplification.
The lesson one could learn in Auschwitz and in other concentration camps in the final analysis was those who were oriented toward a meaning to be fulfilled by them in the future were most likely to survive.
Is a finite freedom, a limited freedom. That is to say, a human being is never fully free from conditions, be they of biological or psychological or sociological kind. But the ultimate freedom is always and remains always reserved to ourselves. That is the freedom to take a stand to whatever conditions might confront us. How we react to the unchangeable conditions is up to ourselves. In other words, if we cannot change the situation, we have always the last freedom to change our attitude to that situation.
Okay, so those were little snippets of some things that he had kind of come to realize through his own suffering and loss. And I think most people can resonate with the idea of, yeah, like initially there's this loss of control, you know, we can't control what happens to us, but actually there's a sense of freedom in that we can actually ultimately control how we respond. And again, just to clarify, that's not to say that, you know, all the things we talked about at the beginning, you know, shouldn't occur. Of course, it's natural to have those emotional roller coasters, and that grieving process is actually part of the healing process. But also thinking about, okay, what actually can I do and now for me? What can I do to find growth and meaning? And I think this little quote here, he who has a why can bear any how, really captures that concept as well. And so I invite you to explore meaning, you know, in a nutshell, what values do I have here? What is meaningful to me right now? And how can I rebuild if the things that I found meaning in I can't do, or it's not available for me? And this can also be relevant for people that are experiencing anticipated loss of even their own life or a loved one as well. We've done some work with a family, for example, where the father was terminal, and they latched on to actually finding meaning in information sharing, and did a bit of a documentary as a family, where, you know, he shared things that he would like them to know and vice versa. So that's an example of, even, you know, in the most difficult of situations, where meaning making really helped him and the family get through that tough time. Another example was, you know, a lot of people have this kind of anticipated fear or loss or grieving over something like their hair falling out. And a couple of people I've worked with have decided to make it into kind of like a ceremonial ritual celebration almost, of actually taking control of that and deciding to shave their hair off on a specific day, surrounded by family and friends. So those are some kind of real life working examples of finding meaning in the midst of grief and loss or anticipated loss. But also you can think about in terms of, okay, what are my values? What do I find meaningful for me? And I've got different kind of categories here, but don't get lost in that. Just kind of think about for you, what kind of crops up for you. And again, highlighting that kind of choice of responding to suffering when things are out of our control is, I think, quite poignant. So if that all seems too much, and it's been too much information to take into, here's some real practical tips to take home. You know, take the time. Self-care is also important when you're feeling, you know, all of those emotions coming through. We know that simply going for walks, the rhythm of the walking, can help us get through a lot of emotional distress. You know, thinking about our hobbies or things we enjoy doing, or creating a routine can be important if you're in the midst of like a red button moment, you know, a red button day. And that can be really helpful to have some form of routine in place. And again, mindful practice, there's so many different audios out there. We have an audio link on our website for a lot of mindfulness exercises that you can use, but also just simply taking some deep breaths. Exploring meaning making if, you know, finding value seems a bit much right now, simply writing down your experiences can be really powerful. And even doing something creative to express those feelings coming through. And actually connecting and communicating with your friends and whānau, like, that's really, really important. We know that social support can have a big impact on, you know, how we're feeling and how we cope with things as well. And if, you know, if you're feeling like you want to talk about any of these things with a neutral person, or you're feeling a little bit stuck, we have one-on-one sessions with a great team of psychologists that are free and available for both individuals going through cancer, but also their supporters as well. And we have lots of group programs and lots of other talks just like this one on different topics. So if something I've mentioned really piqued your interest, and you're thinking, oh yeah, that's me, like for instance, sleep, or communicating with others and that kind of support network, or the emotional roller coaster. So there's a whole myriad of talks that kind of go through those different topics. Strategies for supporters as well is another one. And webinars, so in-person and webinars, in-person when we go down levels, but that's all available as well. And again, you can just register using the same email. So that's there for you. And then that's how you contact us. I will like to mention the Grief Centre now, because if you're really struggling with the loss of a loved one, we recommend the Grief Centre. It's such a great place. They have counselling there as well, and they have group work and lots of resources on their website as well. So that's the Grief Centre there. And they're kind of the gurus for that kind of work as well. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the talk. I have a link there which I will email along with the slides and resources. If you could take the time to do the evaluation sheet, which is an online one, it'll take about a minute, just really about how you found today's talk, things you might like to see changed, or any comments and reflections, that would be really helpful just to refine our service as well. But otherwise, I'm going to